Thank you very much indeed. I am very proud indeed to support and indeed second this bill. A piece of legislation that is anchored in the very best traditions of the Labour Party. We fundamentally believe that work must always pay. It is an absolute fundamental principle for us and for the wider Labour movement. And it is timely now that we reflect on pay policy nationally, and when we do, we should do so in an informed and in an evidence-based way. Now, for many, Minister, the market decides on what you are paid. For others, it's a collective endeavour negotiated between an employer and trade unions through employment-level agreements, collective agreements, or indeed sector employment orders or employment regulation orders. Now, for 130,000 plus of the very lowest paid workers, it has since 2015 been the Statutory Low Pay Commission that recommends, in an evidence-based way, what the rate of the national minimum wage should be for the following year. And adoption, of course, is a matter then for government agreement. But prior to the 2015 Low Pay Commission Act, nobody would say that the way in which the national minimum wage was set was perfect. Far from it. Now, we know that the first minimum wage rate was set and introduced in the year 2000 under the terms of the 2000 Minimum Wage Act. The legislation very much made the setting of the rate a matter for the Minister of the day, with a genuflection in the direction of the social partners. Now, given the experience in 2010, we can say, with hindsight, that giving all that power to the Minister of the day was a bad idea. It turned out to be a very bad idea for low-paid workers. And I say this because we know, Minister, what happened in 2010. As soon as the crash came, Fianna Fáil, at the stroke of a pen, your own party, slashed the national minimum wage by €1, from €8.65 to €7.65 an hour. Now, this was the most callous of cuts, made with the connivance of ideologues in the IMF. Now, I say ideologues because that's exactly what they were. The economic orthodoxy in vogue at the time claimed that by cutting pay, you created jobs. This was always arrant nonsense, and was proven to be the case. Now, without any evidence put forward to challenge that narrative, the lowest paid workers in this country were sent home with a pay cut that they could ill afford. Now, this will be, I think, Minister, with respect, this will be to your party's eternal shame. That cut did not create a single job. It didn't prevent a single worker from losing their job. It didn't create a single hour of additional employment. All it did was lead to penury and more pain for the lowest paid workers in this country. Now, who will ever forget our President, Michael D. Higgins' passionate and forensic demolition of that tawdry and senseless cut made in this House, the very last speech he made here as a Labour Party TD before he went on to be elected and represent us with great pride as our Minister. Now, with that speech ringing in our ears, when we were elected to government in 2011, we almost immediately set about restoring the rate back up to €8.65 an hour. And one of the reasons why we established the Low Pay Commission in the first place was to provide a bulwark against ill-informed, ideologically motivated cuts to the floor of pay beneath which no worker should be allowed to fall. Now, I'm proud, along with my Labour Party colleagues, to have established the Low Pay Commission. It's probably the single most important institutional reform on the statutory landscape to protect and advance the interests of lower paid workers. Now, one of the most significant but underappreciated functions of the Commission is the remit which we gave it in relation to research into low pay. Because resistance to increasing statutory minimum rates of pay among some has been as ill-informed as it has been vociferous and aggressive. There was a dearth of such evidence available in an Irish context to challenge the narrative that was in play in the late 2010s and the early 2011s. The argument went like this: if we went and increased the national minimum wage each year, the sky would fall in. That would be the end of the market economy as we know it. Businesses would close, thousands of jobs would be lost. Now, nothing of the sort happened when we increased the minimum wage twice. And as it happened, Low Pay Commission research from the ESRI confirms what we had said all along. Incremental, predictable increases to the national minimum wage does not close businesses. It does not cost jobs. It can in fact boost the economy, help productivity and help with staff retention. And we know how difficult an issue staff retention is these days. So the Low Pay Commission has changed the conversation. It's changed the debate. It has given us the evidence that we need. It's armed us with the evidence to challenge those bogus arguments that we've been exposed to for years. And it has significantly delivered minimum wage increases every year since 2016. And the biggest single annual increase in that period remains the one that we signed into law in 2015 that came into effect in 2016, a 50-cent an hour increase. Now, if it were not for the statutory function of the Low Pay Commission to make an annual recommendation on the rate of the minimum wage based on a framework embedded in legislation, I think it is safe to assume that we simply would not have seen the annual increases, the likes of which we've seen since the setting up of the Commission. So the question now is, how do we move to a living wage that meets the needs of working people? Now, Government has said in its programme for government, agreed between three parties, that in the lifetime of this administration, we will see the delivery of a living wage. Now, I am sceptical, and I'm not making a narrow political point here. I'm sceptical because of the form of the previous government. I'm sceptical because between 2016 and 2020, that programme for government, that government missed the national minimum wage targets it set out in the programme for government agreed in 2016. And you have yet to tell us how a living wage will be achieved in this country. And since 2016, we have told you how this must be achieved. We've told the last two governments. The Low Pay Commission, as this bill sets out, as my colleague Deputy Batchik has outlined, must be given a target in law to achieve a living wage. Now, this House will be familiar, especially in recent years, with putting targets into law. We have legally binding climate targets. So give the Low Pay Commission a target of reaching a living wage of 2/3 of median hourly income over a 3-year period. If we can have targets for climate and carbon emissions, why can't we have targets to put an end to low pay? In real terms, the living wage at the moment is £12.90 an hour. That's the rate agreed by the Living Wage Technical Group last year as the rate of the living wage for this year. And that happens to be about 2/3 of median hourly income. Now, the gap between the national minimum wage and the living wage is now €2.40 every hour for every hour someone works. So a full-time worker on a real living wage earns just under €100 a week more than someone on the same hours, someone who merely subsists on the national minimum wage. That is intolerable. There's no argument for that. It's unacceptable. The gap between the national minimum wage and the living wage is rising each year, and is becoming even more problematic as low-paid workers who spend every cent they earn on the bills and basics see the value of their hard-earned euro diminish by the week in the context of the cost of living crisis we are experiencing now, and which is likely to continue for the next couple of years. The case for a living wage, Minister, is even more acute than before. So what we need now is a roadmap, a direction of travel anchored in primary legislation to provide certainty both to workers and to employers on how the living wage we want, and you say you are committed to, is to be achieved. Put simply, this is what this bill is fundamentally about. It's about making the historic quest for a living wage that allows everyone who works to have a decent standard of living a reality. And I'll conclude with this, Minister. Poverty hurts. It stays with you all of your life. Now, we clap ourselves on the back in this House collectively. We tell ourselves what a great job we do in this country as our welfare system lifts hundreds of thousands of the working poor out of absolute poverty. But we rarely ask ourselves why we must spend so much on income supports like the working family payment each year. We do so because we allow, this House, this government, we allow bad employers to pay poverty wages. And Minister, it's an absolute scandal that taxpayers spend hundreds of millions each year topping up the meagre subsistence wages paid by hospitality bosses, for example, who have made careers out of extorting more cash from the state. And they're at it again. They're at it again, without any reference whatsoever to the pay terms and conditions of their employees. The people, the very people who make their businesses a success. The very people. Now, a successful society, Minister, would not be comfortable and should not be comfortable with 1 in 5 of its workers on low pay. We need a living wage now. We need to make that a reality now. We need to stop the talk. We need to have action and make sure we put in legislation a target for a living wage attached to the Low Pay Commission to achieve that living wage in law in this country over the next 3 years, to make sure that we end in-work poverty and to make sure that we achieve that aspiration that work should always pay.